Computers, as we know, do lots of very, very useful things for us and have really advanced and pushed on civilization, really. What we're going to look at in this video is situations where computers go wrong, where they should be reliable, where they should be doing things correctly, and because they've been programmed by humans, built by humans, and humans make mistakes, that mistake has resulted in quite a serious situation happening. When your PC has a mistake in its programming, you get a crash or you get the blue screen of death or something like that. You turn the thing off and on again, maybe you've lost 5 or 10 minutes work, it's not a serious problem. However, there are certain situations, certain computer systems that really do have to be reliable. And we all know that things like planes, we would like the systems to work, otherwise we'll fall out of the sky. So what we're going to look at is 5 situations that have occurred in recent history, in fact fairly recent history in some cases, where a computer system has gone wrong and it's actually caused something fairly bad to happen. The first one we'll look at is this ship here. There was a ship in 1997 on September the 21st called the USS Yorktown. It's worth around $1 billion. And they refitted the ship with 27 new computers to control the ship. Each of these had two 200 megahertz processors on, and they decided that they would put the operating system Windows NT onto the computer. At some point while the ship was sailing, it had to try and divide by 0. Now, if we look at what happens when we do this, so if I take a number, let's take the number 10. If I divide that by 2, then I get 5. If I take this and I lower that down and I divide by 1, I'll get 10. And we see as I decrease this number in the denominator, this number over here as the result increases. So if I take 10 and I divide it by a half, then I'm going to get 20. And so on and so on and so on. Eventually, I'm going to get to the point where I try and divide by 0. And this is going to give me an answer which is either undefined or it's infinite. It's just too big. I just can't write this number down. It just go on forever. Now, computers have limited storage. So either in the processor or in RAM, I am limited in the amount of area which I've given for this result to go into. Now, in this case here, I can put the 5 in. I can put the 10 in. I can put the 20 in. But I can't put this infinite number, this number that goes on forever, which is the result of dividing by 0. I cannot put in to here. That's impossible. And so what happens is I try and put some of it in, and then eventually I run out of memory and I get something called an overflow error. In this case, it's a divide by 0 overflow error. Now, what happened on the USS Yorktown was when this simple operation, a divide by 0, occurred, someone hadn't put in the programming to check to see if it was 0. So it tried to divide by 0. It got the overflow error, the buffer overflow error, and then all of the systems crashed. And it wasn't as simple as turning off and on again. In this case, the whole ship, the systems had crashed, the ship couldn't move, and so it had to be towed back to the port, simply because it tried to divide by 0. A fairly simple thing for a programmer to prevent from happening. Number 2. This is an F-52 Raptor, an American warplane. And what we have on planes and also in cars now is a thing called a GPS system. So we have a number of satellites, we've got the world, and we've got a number of satellites that are orbiting the planet. And we've got a country called America, which is here, and a small island called Okinawa, which is here. Let's just draw a little bit more of America. Okay. So these Raptors, 12 of them, are located in America, and they've been tested, and they fly okay, and everything's looking good. And so they decide they're going to go on a mission to Okinawa. And just down here is the international date line. So when I cross over this line here, I'll suddenly advance a day. All of these satellites in the GPS system work off time, they work off the dates. And so it is important that we consider, or the programmers consider, what happens when you go across the date line. In the case of the F-22 Raptors, though, 12 of them, when they crossed the date line, it caused the GPS system to fail, and it didn't just cause that to fail, but the software itself, the whole thing crashed, and so all of the systems went down. We're not talking about just the GPS going down, we're talking about all of the navigation systems, part of the communication systems, and the fuel systems as well. Fortunately, in this case, there was no cloud. The planes continued to fly even though all of these computer systems had gone down, and all 12 of the Raptors managed to land on Okinawa with no one hurt. But it shows just how close it's possible to go. Literally, the plane was flying with sight. If it had been in cloud, they would have been flying blind. Very high chance that those people would have died, or at least had to bail out, and potentially at a cost of 150 million each, it could have been £1 billion worth plus of kit going down the drain. So again, fairly serious problem. Next one. A lot of financial systems are using computers. In fact, pretty much everything now is computerized with respect to stock markets and shares. On October the 19th, 1987, there was a stock market crash. And what happens is investors start selling their shares. So out of the stock market is going millions of shares, a huge amount of money. Now that in itself is fairly normal. There's nothing particularly wrong with stock markets having bad days or good days. But what happens, as the money comes out of the market, the share price falls down. And as the share price is falling down, it reaches a certain point at which other computer systems have been programmed to sell their shares. So if you've got a portfolio of shares which you've bought for a big company, maybe a pension fund, then you will tell it, if the price falls too low, sell your shares at this given price. And so what happened on this stock market crash in 1987 is the share price fell to that price and then kept on falling below, but it was increased by all these other people who were selling their shares now, and the computers were automatically then reaching points at which they would sell shares because the share price had gone too low. In one day, October the 19th, 1987, $500 billion was lost in one day, which equated to 22.6% of the total value of the stock market. An absolutely huge loss. A large proportion of this was caused by computers automatically selling shares when they had really gone too low. There was no need to sell them, or there should have been humans deciding, is this appropriate to actually sell when the market's gone down by 22.6%. It did later recover a lot of that price. There are now stopgaps in place in stock markets to prevent this type of situation happening again. However, there's still a lot of automation and a lot of problems can go wrong. In fact, only very recently in 2012, May 2012, the company called Facebook launched onto the stock market, and there was a glitch because so many people, it's such a popular company, such a popular website, lots of people have heard of Facebook, lots of people wanted to buy shares in it, that system itself had a crash, or not a full crash, but there were a number of situations occurring, and probably somewhere in the region of $100 million was lost because people couldn't trade correctly through the system because the system wasn't working as expected. So this isn't something back in 1987, this is something which happens today very recently as well. Another situation, very famous case of a computer failing. This was a system in Canada, and the system was called Thirac 25. It's an X-ray system, and this was back in 1985. So what happens on an X-ray machine is you get the person and you put them down, and you want to X-ray a part of their body. And there's two modes which Thirac, spelled that wrong, Thirac can operate in. One of them is to have a low intensity beam, which will be a direct beam, and go down as one point. And another alternative way in which Thirac could operate was to spread out this beam and have a high intensity that would cover a wide area. So the beam would be a lot more like this. And so it would spread out that radiation over a much larger area. Now in the old systems, if you wanted to use the high intensity, and the intensity was about 100 times that of this. So the intensity here would be 100 times the intensity here. If you wanted to use this system with the old type, then if you try to use this with 100 times the radiation, physically the hardware would prevent you from doing that. You had to move a switch in order to get the high intensity, and by moving that switch you automatically made it so that it would spread out a long way. What they decided to do with the system which they had in place in 1985 was replace this hardware switch with a software switch. So instead of it preventing you from doing it, it would say, here's a warning, you're not meant to do that, that's going to hurt someone. But you could then override that and say, well, I'll do it anyway. And so what happened in 1985 is that certain patients, a small number of patients, were receiving 100 times the radiation to a small area. So they were getting 100 times the dosage which they were meant to get. This in itself, one situation, caused a patient to have such pain from the immediate radiation of the X-ray that they ran out the room screaming. Later on, patients which had received 100 times the dose would get radiation burns, and in the case of 3 patients, unfortunately, they died as a result of this. And it just goes to show that even when a system is programmed correctly, and there were other slight faults with the Therac 25, which meant that it would accidentally occur as well. However, even when a system is programmed correctly, it can be overridden, and in certain situations that can cause, in this case, people to die. Probably though, while that's a very serious and horrible case, probably the worst case which has ever occurred, which fortunately no one died from. However, it shows just how important it is that computer systems are as reliable as possible in certain systems. So you have 2 blocks in the Cold War, which are mainly Russia and America. And so you have Russia over here and you've got America over here. And during the Cold War, there's a lot of fear about nuclear weapons. And there's this idea that if we have lots of nuclear weapons pointing at the other country, then it'll be mutual destruction. If Russia fires its nuclear weapons at America, automatically America will fire at Russia. And the idea, the principle, which really did work actually, was no one's going to start a nuclear war because instantly they know their country is going to be annihilated as well. And computer systems were involved in detecting, has a nuclear war been started? So in September 1983, 26th of September, in a secret bunker which is near Moscow, which is somewhere around here, the alarm bells go off. And Lieutenant Colonel Petrov is sitting at his desk, and the alarm bells are going off just after midnight, with a satellite showing that there are 5 nuclear ballistic missiles which are now coming towards Russia. So imagine the situation. You're sitting at your desk, you're being told that already 5 warheads have been fired towards Russia. And it's not just 5 warheads, because about a week before, there's been a military exercise carried out by the Americans and NATO, which has raised tensions. And that's as a result of the Russians shooting down a South Korean airliner, which is seen as a hostile act. So there's all the pretext to a war occurring, and then all of a sudden the Americans respond to shooting down that plane by sending over 5 missiles. It is undoubtedly the closest which the world has ever got to annihilation via a nuclear war. Lieutenant Colonel Petrov decides, his gut feeling is, that the Americans would not send just 5 warheads. They would in fact send more like hundreds of warheads, because why just send 5? Why have a small attack? So he decides to ignore the warnings, go against his instruction and what he's meant to do, which is to advise a nuclear war, and he decides that he won't do that. As a result of that, nuclear war is averted, the Russians don't attack America. It's later found out that it genuinely was a false alarm, and it was caused by one of the satellites seeing the reflection of the sun off of a cloud top. So this is a situation here where it was very, very close to causing a nuclear war by a computer system malfunctioning. And so once again it highlights the importance of having reliable systems and the necessary reliability which is appropriate for the situation in which you're placing computer systems.